For 30 years, the people of Cedar Bend watched an old man tend a garden over an empty grave, and for 30 years, they were certain he had lost his mind. Every morning, in every season, Ezra Boone walked the half-mile from his small house at the edge of town to the little hillside cemetery, and there he knelt beside a single white headstone, and he worked. He planted. He weeded. He watered with buckets carried up the hill on his bent old back. Around that one stone he had built, over 3 decades, the most beautiful garden anyone in the territory had ever seen, climbing roses and lavender, foxglove and bluebells, a riot of color that bloomed from the first thaw to the first frost, all of it surrounding a single grave with a single name carved into the marble: Marian Boone, beloved wife, lost to the river, returned to God. And the people of Cedar Bend, who were not cruel but only practical, shook their heads and said the same thing they had said for 30 years. Poor old Boone talks to a grave like she can hear him. 30 years of grieving a woman whose body they never even found. They would lower their voices. It isn't right, a man giving his whole life to a stone. He ought to have moved on. He ought to have let her go. But Ezra Boone never let her go. He knelt in that garden every single morning, and as he worked, he talked softly, gently, the way a man talks to a wife across a breakfast table, telling the cold marble about the weather, about the roses, about the long and lonely years. And every morning, he ended the same way, with his rough old hand pressed flat against the top of the stone. "I'm still here, Marian," he would whisper. "I'm still keeping it beautiful for you. I'll never stop." The town thought him a fool. The town thought him mad. The town had no idea that the grave he knelt beside was empty, and that the woman beneath that name was, at that very moment, more than 200 miles away, alive. To understand the garden, you have to understand the river, and the day it took her. 30 years before, Ezra and Marian Boone had been young and poor and wildly happy, married only 2 years, building a life on a homestead along the Sweetwater River. Marian had been the brightness of his whole world, quick to laugh, quick to sing, with dark hair she could never quite keep pinned, and gray eyes that had looked at plain, quiet Ezra Boone, as though he were the only man on earth. Then came the spring of the great flood. The rains fell for 9 days without stopping, and on the 9th day, the Sweetwater rose up out of its banks in the dark of night, a wall of black water and broken timber that came down on the low homesteads without warning. Ezra had been across the river helping a neighbor move stock to high ground. By the time he fought his way back, his own home was gone, torn from its foundation, swept away, and Marian with it. They searched for 2 weeks. They found pieces of the house a mile downstream. They found her shawl caught in a cottonwood. They never found her. A river that takes a body in flood does not always give it back, the old-timers said gently. There was nothing to bury. And so Ezra Boone bought a plot on the hill and set a white stone over the empty earth and carved his wife's name into it, because a man needs a place to bring his grief. And then, because flowers had been the thing she loved most in all the world, he planted one rosebush beside the stone. He never planned to plant a second, but the first one bloomed so beautifully the next spring that he found himself thinking she would have loved it, and a man who has lost everything will hold on to anything that lets him feel close to what he lost. So he planted another, and another, and the years went by, and the garden grew, and the grief never left. But it learned to live alongside the flowers, and Ezra Boone built his dead wife the most beautiful garden in the territory, because it was the only way he had left to love her. He was wrong about only one thing. She was not dead. 200 miles downriver, in a town called Larkspur, she had never chosen and could not remember coming to, a woman had been pulled from the water that long ago spring more dead than alive. A widow named Esther Good had found her tangled in the willows at the river's edge, half drowned, her head struck and bleeding, more dead than living. Esther had taken her home and nursed her through a fever that lasted a month. And when at last the woman opened her eyes, she could not say who she was, or where she had come from, or even her own name. The blow to her head and the terror of the water had swept her memory as clean as the flood had swept the homestead. She had nothing on her but the clothes she'd drowned in, and a small tarnished locket on a chain around her neck, a locket rusted so tightly shut by the river water that it could not be opened. Esther Good was a childless widow with a lonely house and a kind heart, and she took the nameless woman in as her own. They called her Mary, for lack of any other name. A name that, had either of them only known it, sat just one letter away from the truth. And Mary lived a quiet, gentle life in Larkspur for 30 years, keeping Esther's house, tending Esther's modest store, growing old beside the woman who had saved her. She never married. Something in her, some shadow she could not name, always whispered that her heart already belonged somewhere she could not remember. And every day of those 30 years, she wore the rusted locket against her chest and wondered what was inside it, and never had the heart to force it open. It felt, somehow, like the last door to a self she had lost. She was afraid of what might be behind it. So she let it stay shut until Esther Good died. Esther passed in her sleep one winter, 90 years old and at peace, and Mary, who was the only family the old woman had, was left to settle her affairs and grieve the second mother she'd been given. And in her grief, going through Esther's things, she found among them a jeweler's small kit of tools. And she thought, at last, of the locket. She did not know why she chose that night, of all the nights in 30 years, to finally open it. Perhaps grief had worn down her fear. Perhaps some clock in the blood had simply run out its time. But she sat by the fire with the tarnished locket and Esther's small tools, and with trembling hands she worked the rusted clasp, until, with a tiny click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent house, it sprang open. Inside was a faded curl of dark hair tied with thread. And inside the cover, almost worn away, but still legible, were words engraved by a clumsy, loving hand. To my Marian, my whole heart, Ezra, Cedar Bend. The woman who had been called Mary for 30 years sat very still. And then the name went through her like the river itself, Marian, and behind it came a face, a plain, gentle, kind face, a man's voice saying her name across a breakfast table, a homestead by the water, the smell of roses, Ezra, 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 30 years of locked doors, flung open all at once, the whole drowned past, surging up out of the dark. And Marian Boone put her hands to her mouth and wept, because she suddenly knew exactly who she was, and exactly whom she had left behind. She was on the first stage out of Larkspur the next morning, heading for a town called Cedar Bend, to find out whether a man she had not seen in 30 years was still alive and whether he had waited. She walked back into Cedar Bend on a bright morning in early summer. The first person to see her was old Del Hartley, who had run the livery for 40 years, and who took one look at the gray-haired woman stepping down from the stage and went white as a sheet and had to sit down hard on a hay bale. He knew that face. He had known it 30 years younger, but he knew it. The whole town knew it. It was carved on a headstone up on the hill. Word ran through Cedar Bend like fire through dry grass. The Boone woman, Marian Boone. She's come back. She's alive. Doors flew open. People spilled into the street. They followed her, a slow, stunned, growing crowd as she walked, half remembering, through the town she had not seen in 30 years, toward the only place she knew to look. Up the half-mile road, up the green hillside, toward the cemetery. And there, kneeling in a glory of roses and lavender and bluebells, his back bent and his hair gone white, an old man worked in a garden he had built over an empty grave, talking softly, as he did every morning, to a stone. "I planted the white roses you always wanted, Marian," Ezra Boone was murmuring, his hand moving among the blooms. "Took me years to get them to take, but they're beautiful now. You'd love them. I wish you could." He heard the crowd before he understood it. He turned, still kneeling, squinting up the hill at the strange, silent gathering. And then the crowd parted. And a gray-haired woman, with eyes he had wept for every single day for 30 years, stepped through and stood at the edge of the garden he had grown for her, and spoke in a voice that broke on the only word that mattered. "Ezra," said Marian Boone, "I came home." The trowel fell from the old man's hand. He rose, trembling, disbelieving, one shaking hand reaching out toward a ghost. "Marian," he whispered. "Marian, they told me the river they never found. I buried." His voice gave out entirely. "The river took my memory, my love," she wept, coming toward him through the roses, "not my life. I have been 30 years lost from myself, but I am found now. And the first thing I remembered, the very first thing, was you." Ezra Boone took his wife in his arms, in the middle of the garden he had built over her empty grave, and the whole town of Cedar Bend stood on that green hillside and wept to watch it. Every soul who had ever called him a fool, every soul who had ever shaken their head and said he ought to have let her go. He had not let her go, and she had come home. They had 11 years together at the end. 11 years no one had dreamed either of them would be given. They tended the garden together now, the two of them, side by side on their knees in the roses, an old man and an old woman with 30 stolen years between them and not one moment to waste. Ezra had the headstone taken up and laid flat as a garden bench, and the carving changed so that it no longer said, "Lost to the river." It said, instead, in fresh-cut letters, "Marian Boone, lost to the river, returned to her love." Some gardens are only ever planted in faith. The town never called him a fool again. They told his story instead to their children and their grandchildren, the story of the man who tended a grave for 30 years because he could not stop loving the woman beneath the name, and who was rewarded, in the end, with the one thing no one believed could happen. When at last they died, within a season of each other as the old and devoted so often do, the people of Cedar Bend buried them together beneath the white roses, in the most beautiful garden in all the territory. And the roses bloomed there, still planted, every one of them, in 30 long years of a faith the whole world had laughed at. A faith that turned out in the end to be right.